Chapter 3. The hitching rail in front of the new Powder Valley Courthouse was lined with saddle horses. Down the street, the rail in front of the Gold Eagle Saloon was similarly lined. This was unusual for an evening in the middle of the week, and was in response to the word that there had been quickly and quietly passed around about an important meeting of all the male citizens in the valley. A lot of riders had drifted in out of curiosity, and others were drawn to the meeting by the rumors of free beer in the courthouse yard. Others, who were indebted to Eustus Arlo in one way or another, had received instructions practically amounting to orders for them to be present with all their hands. No one seemed to know exactly why the meeting had been called, nor what it was about. There was all sorts of rumors going the rounds. The most persistent of these was that Pat Stevens had decided to resign as sheriff, and the meeting had been called to select his successor. A lot of the ranchers didn't believe that because they knew Pat well and hadn't heard him say anything about resigning, but everyone seemed to agree that the meeting had something to do with the office of the sheriff or the enforcement of the lax laws of the community. At this stage of its development, Powder Valley had a rather peculiar system of self-government based on expediency rather than on strict interpretation of the state laws. There was no actual defining boundaries of the county, nor were there any duly elected county officials. Powder Valley was an isolated community separated from its neighbors by its mountains on all sides, and for years past it had been customary to settle any indifferences of opinion among its inhabitants by meetings such as had been called on for tonight. With no complex questions of law to vex them, a majority vote was all that was required to make a decision, and the minority always swung into line with the rest when they found that they were defeated. It was actually a practical demonstration of pure democracy in action, and the people of the valley had lived together peaceably a good many years, with no real cleavage of opinion. The crowd around the 2 barrels of beer set up in front of the courthouse were orderly and good-natured. Most of the men had known most of the others for years, and they'd made the meeting into sort of a social occasion for exchanging news about their families and information about the conditions of pasturage and the new calf crop. Eustus Arlo was very much in evidence among the group around the beer barrels. He was a big man with a hearty voice and a genial manner. He wore a big white Stetson and a red silk shirt with leather vest decorated with heavy colches of Mexican gold. He had a wide, hand-carved belt with a big gold buckle in front, and the bottoms of his pants were tucked into small handmade boots with figures formed on them by ornamental white stitching. His big roweled spurs had little copper bells on them that tinkled as he moved, and a big square-cut diamond glistened from the ring on his hand. Yet all this display, in contrast to the shabby work clothes of the other ranchers, didn't make Eustus Arlo seem affected or overdressed. He was a man who could wear that sort of thing and get away with it. He had broad shoulders and big strong hands, and his face was weather-beaten by the Texas sun and wind. He looked like a man who fought hard and worked hard to reach his present position at the top, and like one who intended to stay there. His gray eyes had a light and of cold appraisal even when he laughed heartily, and his blunt chin was aggressively square. There were some who didn't like Arlo, and a few who feared him, but mostly the citizens of Powder Valley felt they were lucky that such a man should have sold out his huge holdings in Texas and come to Colorado to re-establish himself. As they said approvingly one to another while they waited for the meeting to open, he was the kind of man who made things hum when he was around. He didn't sit back and let any grass grow under his feet, by golly. Even those who owed him money didn't know how they'd paid off their mortgages thought that it was a good thing for the valley when Arlo decided to settle there. When they began drifting into the courthouse to take seats on the long wooden benches in the big meeting room, Arlo was at the door with a handshake and a brief word for each man who entered. Somehow he managed to give the impression that he was the host, and that this was his courthouse and his meeting. All of them knew that they had been drinking his beer, of course, so it wasn't difficult to go a step further and accept his leadership in the valley affairs. Even the old-timers like John Boyd and Mr. Winters, who resented Eustus Arlo and felt he was a menace to their valley, found it impossible to put their finger on anything Arlo said or did to put him in the wrong. There wasn't any reason why he shouldn't stand at the door and shake hands with them as they went in as if he wanted to. It was all open and above board. But it put them at a disadvantage, and they felt it, and Arlo knew that they felt it. The only thing you could do if you didn't like it was to stay away from the meeting, and that would be playing right into Arlo's hands. So they all went in and sat on the benches, inwardly writhing at the masterly way in which Arlo handled the situation, but not knowing how to circumvent his tactics. When the last booted and sweaty rancher was inside, Eustus Arlo left his place at the door and went up to the long piney table in the front of the room. He stood neglectingly with his fingertips touching the table and addressed them bluntly. "I'm not an orator, and I don't aim to do any orating tonight. I called this meeting to find out what we're going to do about a new sheriff in Powder Valley." Mr. Winters was sitting in the front row. He ran the general store in Dutch Springs and was the postmaster, and for years he had sort of unofficially run things in Powder Valley. John Boyd, Pat's nearest neighbor, sat at Winters' right. He was a stringy, taciturn man who would have gone to hell and back for Pat Stevens. EZRA was on Winters' left, and beyond him was Sam Salone. Sam was one of the few men in the room who packed a gun to the meeting. As Pony Express rider, Sam always rode his route armed, and he didn't take his .45 off while he was in town because he would have felt undressed without it. EZRA and Sam and Boyd stirred uneasily and looked at Mr. Winters when Arlo made his blunt opening statement. The storekeeper got to his feet at once, and he said mildly, "I reckon most of us didn't know we were going to be doing anything about getting a new sheriff. I hadn't heard about Pat Stevens turning in his badge yet." There was a shuffle of feet and a murmur of agreement from the benches behind him. "Well, perhaps he hasn't turned in his badge," Arlo assented. "I've been checking up, and I don't believe we have to wait for Stevens to resign. The way I see it, he was in office by majority vote, and I guess he can be put out by the same way, and by a majority of us that are here tonight." Winters had remained standing. "Why, I guess that is right," he agreed. His voice was incredulous. "Do you reckon we're going to vote Pat Stevens out of office, after all he's done for the valley?" "Well, that's exactly what I'm hoping you're going to do. I know you're all friends of Stevens, and I like him myself. He's a fine man, and I don't deny he's done some mighty fine things in the past, but that's in the past. We can't afford to keep a sheriff on his past reputation. We need one that will do things now." John Boyd got up angrily. "Are you hinting that Pat ain't making us a good sheriff?" "Oh, I'm not hinting at anything," Eustus Arlo told him. "I'm saying it right out in the open and loud in the meeting here." He showed his white teeth in a wide smile. "I'm not the kind of man that makes hints. I come in straight out and fast, and I say my piece." He thudded his right fist in the palm of his left with emphasis. "I'm losing my cattle off my ranch every day. Expensive, blooded stock, and Sheriff Stevens hasn't done a single thing to stop the rustling, though I've appealed to him time and time again. I can't stay here and go on with my plans to build up in this cow country if this sort of thing keeps going on." "Well, it was pretty good cow country before you stuck your nose in here," Boyd told him angrily. Arlo smiled tolerantly at the old man. "You mean that we're satisfied, you and the rest of you? But do you think I got where I got today by being satisfied?" "Just where are you right now?" Sam Sloane spoke up. Arlo told him evenly. Well, I'm not riding Pony Express to earn my living. He turned his attention away from the men in the front of the bench as Sam's face darkened angrily. He lifted his voice and went on. If we're going to be having any real progress in this valley, we've got to wake up and organize on an orderly basis. In the first place, I understand that Pat Stevens doesn't even draw a salary as sheriff. It's no wonder he hasn't time nor inclination to run down the rustlers that are stealing my stock. We've got to put a man in the sheriff's office who'll devote his full time to the job of maintaining order here in Powder Valley. I'm here to make a fair offer. Out of my own pocket, I'll pay half the salary of the new sheriff.
Makes a man wonder why you're so anxious to get Pat out of office. When a man spends money, he generally has a good reason, Winters said.
That's right, Arlo told him. I'll save money by getting an energetic sheriff on the job. Maybe some of you have wondered about the new hands that I've been hiring lately. I intend to protect my cattle from rustlers if I have to hire a private army of gun hands to do it. It'll be cheaper for me to pay the entire salary of a sheriff. Most of the men in the room glanced aside at half a dozen riders who had entered quietly after the others and stood slouching against the wall. All were armed with guns in open holsters worn low on the hip for a fast draw. They were a hard-biting bunch. Their leader was a tall, thin-faced man with a droopy, sandy mustache.
Well, if you're losing cattle, you're the only man in the valley that is. Me, I kind of doubt it, though,
John Boyd said harshly. Arlo's features hardened. Are you calling me a liar? Boyd shrugged and spat a stream of tobacco juice on the crack on the floor.
You got anyone to back your story?
Arlo looked up at the men along the wall. Well, how about it, Tex? You tell them about the rustlers.
Oh, him.
Boyd looked at the sandy-mustached gunman scornfully.
Sure, he'd back your lie.
The gunman stepped away from the wall with his eyes fixed on the seamed face of the aged rancher. His thumbs were hooked inside his gun belts in front, and he moved with a stealthy flowing stride like a snake crossing the floor. In a gentle Texas drawl that held unmistakable menace, he asked, Would you be meaning me, mister? Ezra started to get up, but Sam Sloane put a hand on the big man's shoulders and forced him back to the bench. He got up instead. His hand was openly on the butt of his gun, and his dark face was distorted as he snarled.
Pick me if you're looking for trouble.
Tex stopped and surveyed him unconcerned, a grin twitching the thin lips beneath his mustache. Before he could speak, Eustus Arlo said, Well, let's not have this sort of thing, gentlemen. We can settle this without shooting. The only question before this meeting is whether we should appoint someone to take Pat Stevens' place as sheriff of Powder Valley. Votes are better than bullets.
He's right,
said a quiet voice from the back of the room.
Sit down and cool off, Sam.
It was Pat Stevens. He sauntered forward with lamplight gleaming from the silver star on his shirt. Sam Sloane glared at Pat and then sat down. Tex surveyed the newcomer carefully and then moved back to lean against the wall again. Eustus Arlo's face hardened as Pat came towards him, and he said bitterly, I hoped you wouldn't hear about this meeting in time to attend. I figured it'd be easier on you this way. Well, that's pretty considerate of you, Mr. Arlo. I sure appreciate you trying to spare my feelings. He nodded to Boyd and the storekeeper. Howdy, John. And then sauntered past them to stand beside Arlo at the table. We've decided, Arlo told him loudly, to make up a salary and appoint a full-time sheriff of Powder Valley. and I'll be paying half the salary out of my own pocket." "Well, in that case," said Pat reasonably, "I reckon it's likely you'd want to be naming the new sheriff yourself." He reached up and unpinned the silver star from his shirt. "I won't be standing in your way none." He dropped the silver badge on the table in front of Arlo.
"Don't do it, Pat."
Winter was on his feet instantly, and from behind him came a low murmur of disapproval. But it was a low murmur, and came from the scattered throats throughout the crowded benches. There was probably 30 men in the room. Pat knew that more than half of them were in Arlo's debt in one way or another, and all those had hands with them. He had an idea how the voting would go if it was put to a test. He shook his head at Winters and said, "You and me ain't been free enough loaning our money out. I reckon Arlo's got this game sewed up the way he wants it, and I wouldn't want to embarrass my neighbors by making him go off and voting on the record against me. I'll be done. I'm resigning the sheriff's job so you all can pin the star on whoever you want." He turned and walked down the hall and out the door. Sam Salone and Ezra followed him out angrily, and Boyd and Winters went after him. Other men got up and went out silently until less than 20 remained. They sat on the benches silently, not looking at each other nor saying anything. Arlo waited until the last man was gone, leaned against the table with a grim grin on his lips. When he was sure the defection was complete, he said, "It looks as though we could get down to business now without having any more trouble. I suggest we pin this star on Tex and pay him $50 a month. He's a stranger in the valley and won't play favorites. If he needs any deputies, he can call them off my ranch any time he wants. Has anyone a better idea?" Nobody offered a better idea. Eustus Arlo then pinned the silver badge of office on the Texas gun hand, and the ranchers shambled out awkwardly into the night. End of chapter 3.